But little things like planting trees, building community, talking to people, I do think make some kind of difference. If for nothing else, then it like shows people how they can exist in community and be together. And if we're doing that with people who are outside of those voices of who is traditionally prioritized, who fits into the dominant narrative, who is considered scientists, then again, kind of the combination of those two things really opens up the possibilities that are in front of us. And I think is what we need to be able to think creatively about resilient cities and resilient futures.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick, and I'm broadcasting from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grid City and the native land of the Puyallup tribe and Stilican peoples. This is Tree Hugger Podcast, the show where we reimagine ecological restoration, and the episode where we discuss urban ecology, trees, and community care and well-being. If you are observing the new year, here is to a good purging of 2022, and maybe to an abundant year of 2023. I always get a bit sentimental and reflect during this time of year what my intentions have been, what isn't working, what is happening in the moment, and how I am going to do my thing in the new year with what I got available to me and with whom I'm doing the things. I'm still scrapping episodes together, and we are still reimagining ecological restoration together and learning what that means for the show's overlapping themes of human health, livelihoods, and environmental justice in a warming world. I'm grateful for all the listeners out there. It definitely takes a community to keep the Tree Hugger Podcast going. Before we get started, I want to let you know the Reimagine Restoration store is now up. Follow the link in the show notes to see how you can rep the show. There is currently a limited selection in the store and currently a work in progress I'll keep you updated on. A portion of your purchase will help support the show. Right now, enter the code REIMAGINE for 10% off until the end of January 2023. Now, I'm not going to recite a big year in review, but I do want to acknowledge the power that my guests bring to each discussion as we explore this show's central themes. Sometimes the messages are simple and clear, and often I find the topics we cover are complex and messy, requiring further questioning, internal activism, and time to consider. My intention and hope are that the podcast empowers you and enables some feeling of control over your actions when you engage in restorative practices with the earth. Both virtually and in person, this past year we reckoned with a lot, including grief and the range of emotions we feel when confronted with climate change impacts. We discuss ways to build personal resilience through practices like deliberate cold exposure. We heard from professors in the environmental humanities about the origins of restoration that have emerged from the archives of early environmental writers and ecologists. We critiqued Western conservationism and explored healing through indigenous science and ways of knowing. We dipped our toes into seed-based restoration and talked about bringing kids into the science and practice of applied ecology. And lastly, we have cultivated our relationship with more than human nature, like ways to think about a renewed outlook on invasive species. Looking at what we learned this past year on the podcast while also considering the restoration-related topics that light my fire right now, I think you'll see more integration with all the irons I have in the fire. That means all the undertakings and projects I'm involved with, such as community greening and resilience building here where I live in Tacoma, interacting with folks across the range of Pacific Madrone, and building a more robust forest adaptation network. Turning to the now, talking about urban trees and forests is part of the DNA of Tree Hugger Podcast. My guest on this episode reminds us of the importance of nearby nature and power and community that orbits around urban ecology. Renata Kamakura is a PhD student at Duke University's Clark Lab, a NatureNet Science Fellow, and a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. Renata's current work sits mostly within the realm of urban ecology. They study tree health in urban forests, specifically how both volunteer and paid tree maintenance can increase tree health, patterns in urban tree health through time and across geographies, and how to support managers and planners in designing urban forests that will support human and non-human communities with climate change. Renata has authored and collaborated on published papers focused on the pace of tree migration and invasion in tallgrass prairies, also tree fecundity related to size and age, as well as indirect climate effects. Long story short, I know Renata because they have some insights on the phenology, growth, mortality, and local adaptation of Pacific madrone. Now, if you listen to the podcast, I'm pretty sure you know something about me. Pacific madrone is my favorite tree. I find a lot of excuses to bring it up, even when it doesn't make sense. If you haven't listened to it already, you can track back to the Tree Hugger episode called Madrones with our Arbutus Army from February 2021 to hear some Madrone 101 from me and my Army comrades. So back to Renata's contribution to the body of thoughts around Pacific madrone. After completing an undergraduate degree in biology from the University of Chicago in 2018, they worked as a conservation land management intern for the Forest Service at the Dorena Genetic Resource Center in Oregon. While there, Renata worked with forest geneticist Richard Sniezko and others to investigate the degree of local adaptation in Pacific madrone, one of our most beloved local hardwood species. Now, I'll put a link to that published paper from October 21 in the show notes. Despite its beauty and resilience, madrone is complicated. There's a bunch of myths surrounding the species, but this research is important because it does support people who are interested in restoring and maintaining the species. It's kind of one of its kind, so I really want to elevate it. So I don't want to give too much away too soon. Just listen for that part of the conversation. And it's been a bit of a long time coming. Renata has been super busy and important, busy with her work, being a PhD candidate. Renata is way more than madrones. Renata grew up all over the place from what I can gather and has almost always lived in cities and appreciates the life and diversity that exists in urban areas. On Renata's website, they have a grounding vision that resonates with me and probably you too. It says, "We're in the midst of tackling an impending climate crisis, ongoing economic inequality, racial injustice, the carceral state, and colonial exploitation. Reckoning with the failures in our current social and economic system is long overdue, and I hope we can use this opportunity to reimagine how we as humans live with and among the rest of the natural world. I aim to be part of that reimagining by looking at our urban forests, organizing for societal change, and interrogating some of the values embedded in ecological science." That's a good jumpstart to our conversation that ranges from statistics to Pacific madrone to tree health in cities like Chicago and Durham. We also talked about how tree-focused organizations can contribute to social change in a community, complementing their efforts through organizing with neighbors. And lastly, we talked some emergent strategy and reading of radical feminism, specifically embracing small changes and mimicking nature and expanding the possibilities for better futures. I'm glad to bring you this episode. It starts right here. Enjoy the conversation.
I'm Renata Kamakura. I am a PhD student at Duke somehow now. And I like to think of myself as someone who's like learning to be a scientist, learning some statistics somehow in the middle, but also likes to just start some good trouble kind of around in the process. So doing a little bit of organizing, learning on the way, learning a lot about nonprofits and other things that are working in the cities I live in, and trying to just kind of expand my understanding of not just the science of trees and green spaces, but also how we make change to make places more livable.
Cool. That's excellent. I like that. I like that term, good trouble. I don't know if there's a definition for it, but I know it. I think I know what you mean.
There's the historical version of good trouble, which I think is a much more ambitious level of disruption, push for social change that maybe someday I hope to get to. At least a lot of what I'm thinking is like, let's just push the systems we're in a little bit to not get too complacent, because the world changes. What justice demands shifts, and we also kind of can always do better from what we're stuck with. So how do we not get too stuck in what we've always done to keep pushing for what's better?
Nice. So you mentioned you're a Duke. You said somehow, I think. I don't know. Can you just tell us what your path to Duke looks like or looked like?
Oh, totally. There is a vision of what you wanted at one point, but most of how you got there was a little bit of luck, a little bit of things just fell into place, and then you just kind of went for it. So I went to school in Chicago, and I thought I was going to do neuroscience, realized that was not for me when I tried the research, just was not being in a basement, not what I wanted to do. So decided to try being outside a little bit, fell in love with ecology research, realized that I'm much more of a plant person than an insect person, which is good to learn early. So then I was trying to find out ways to work with plants. And what I actually ended up doing after I graduated is I thought I wanted to be working in kind of land management. And so I worked for the Forest Service for a little while, and I actually loved it. I was in this little field station called Dorina, or Dorina Genetic Resource Center, out in Oregon, and learned a ton about just restoration ecology, but the actual planting of the trees, propagating or growing the little plants in greenhouses and then putting them out and seeing how it worked. I also realized at the same time that at the end of the day, I am an academic. I'm a bit of a nerd. I love doing research. And so there were a bunch of incredible people who spent a lot of time kind of like honing their craft and getting very good at growing trees. And I deeply respected it, but I could not do that every day of my life. I'm like, yes, but I want to be like messing around with things and trying stuff out on the side. And so I was lucky to find folks where I was at Dorina who let me experiment a little. And that's where I ended up kind of working with madrone. Actually, was me having a passion side project because I was getting a little bored on the side. And then I ended up working for a nonprofit a little bit to see if that kind of space was what I wanted. Learned a lot there as well about kind of life in nonprofits, and then decided that, yes, I do need to get a further degree because at the end of the day, I'm an academic and like to do research. So that's part of how I ended up in grad school at all. And frankly, Duke, as I was working, especially the nonprofit, I realized that I need to do stats to do my job. And my stats is okay, not stellar. And the advisor here is really, really good at Bayesian statistics. So it's like fun cocktail conversation. You just throw out the word Bayesian and people immediately get terrified. But it's basically just a way to look at the world that, and a way to use statistics that I think is pretty useful. And I'm excited to learn.
Cool. Statistics. You seem very enthusiastic about it. I think some people, like you said, are lukewarm about it, but let's talk about some more. What turns, for lack of a better term, what kind of turns you on about statistics? Because I feel like they're very important when you're reading, like, when you're doing big sort of research like we're about to talk about.
Totally. It's a good question. I think at the end of the day, statistics is just a tool to get at understanding the world, just like science is in general. The thing about stats that I find, or I found frustrating, now I find interesting and exciting, is that a lot of times the way I was taught statistics in high school or college is they really taught you like two different tools, like kind of like a hammer and maybe a jackhammer. And you're like, all right, we got a problem in front of us. You can either use a hammer, a jackhammer, but that's really all you know how to do. And then instead, ahead of you, you have like a screw. Neither of those two things are very helpful for the thing you've got ahead of you. So what instead people end up doing is hammering it as hard as they can. And then when that doesn't work, they try a jackhammer on it. And then it still doesn't work, but they at least made some kind of change. And they're like, well, you know what? I've got something here. Whereas if you actually learned how to build yourself a screwdriver, or better yet, like a power tool that can screw something into a wall, suddenly you're like able to get at the problem in a lot more and a lot clearer of a way. And so I think there's a lot of arguments out in the world as to which form of statistics is the best. And two of the big, let's say, disagreeing groups of people are people who consider themselves frequentists and people who consider themselves Bayesians. I won't spend too much time on this divide because if anyone wants to go in a deep dive, more than welcome. Good luck to you in the Wikipedia abyss.
I bet there's an online quiz where I could
I'm
ask
so
me,
sure.
maybe I could figure out which one I am.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I'm so sure some person out there in a stats program has decided to make that pop quiz for you. That I will give you maybe my quick plug for Bayesian statistics and the thing that I think is cool about it. So one of the kind of fundamental differences is in the world, let's say you collect data on something. So like I count the number of birds that fly past my window. All right. And let's say it's this migration season. So I'm expecting a lot of birds to fly past my window. Okay, great. So I've counted the number of birds and I try to use that to estimate how many birds there are in general. Okay, that's like something we do, or some version of that is something we do very often. Okay, so if you're using Bayesian statistics, let's say I see 0 birds outside my window. I don't know. I got unlucky. I only watched it for like 5 minutes. Who knows? I'm not going to then conclude there are no birds. And the reason for that primarily is because I know there are birds. I go walk outside sometimes. Maybe my friend told me there are birds. I know there are birds. I just didn't see them, right? It's kind of basically the basic idea. Bayesian statistics allows you to do that by saying, okay, I already know some things that are true. I already know that birds exist somewhere out there. We have lots of data that says that there are birds out there. Even if my data set doesn't tell me that that doesn't mean I conclude that that's definitely the case, that my data of 0 birds outside the window means there's literally 0 birds. So what it means is we use all the other information we have, which we can consider what's called a prior, to then make sure that when we are analyzing our data, that's not the only information we take into account, right? We take into account everything else we already know. I think that's kind of cool because it means that you're like analyzing the strength of your own data set. Whether you have like 10 trees, I would be much less confident in my results than if I had 10,000 trees, right? So it allows you to just kind of hedge your bets a little bit. And then your outcome is informed not just by the data you collected, by things more broadly. Some people will say, kind of as a counter argument, that you're then quote biasing your results because instead of just using your data set by itself, you're letting it be influenced by other things. My general opinion is that we're already being influenced by other things, might as well be honest about it. But there's lots of reasons why people feel differently. So that approach of like being able to take what we already know and use that as well as the data we're collecting is kind of the approach that I'm learning, and I have found to be really cool and exciting.
Yeah, you brought up so many things. Kind of the search for objectivity, I think, in science is one
Totally.
thing that I'm always thinking about. And then just like a different way of knowing the ecosystem or whatever the system is that you're studying. So go stats.
We're not at a point, I think, or at least I have not read literature that does a good job of encompassing maybe some of the other non-numerical or non-scientific ways of knowing into these priors for Bayesian
Mm.
statistics. And that might not even be the way to go, but it does give you a little bit more leeway to try out stuff like that, where you can say like, okay, we know that in general, these two things are related because people have known that for generations, for example. We can say that there's a relationship, we just don't know what it is. We can try out stuff like that and allow us to kind of put in stuff that people are telling us, that locals are telling us, that people who've lived in a place are
Mm-hmm.
telling us, and start from there instead of starting from ground zero.
Mm-hmm.
Because people already know so much, like why not acknowledge that?
Yeah, yeah. I feel like that acquisition of knowledge or gathering of data, making observations, it's like it's been going on since time immemorial. So I'm always interested in like co-creation, I guess, of knowledge. And yeah, I'm just always amazed by some collaborations I've seen lately.
Totally. I
So,
find in my work, I'm constantly being challenged by both just people out in the world in the cities who I talk to, social scientists that I learn from to think more broadly about my kind of very hard sciencey numbers based data sets that I'm collecting and thinking about the context in which they exist, the things that they're missing because they're just not set up to analyze those things, and being careful about when we write papers or when we suggest either like restoration practices or maybe management practices or things like this, that we're aware that our data give us a piece of information, but they can't tell us everything. Nothing ever can.
mm-hmm.
Like you said with scientific objectivity too, like even the way we started asking the question influences the types of things we can get at the end. So making sure that we're pretty transparent about what options were even on the table that we're then trying to kind of choose between at the end of our study can
Mm.
be really, really helpful in thinking about what actual outcomes we feel
Yeah.
justified in supporting.
Good segue, because I will tell you, I am totally acting on some things I read in the madrone paper, and you might be like, whoa, 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 pump the brakes. I'm not ready to really those recommendations. I would temper those a little bit. So you published a paper. You're the primary author on this publication that came out in October, actually
2021.
2021. So about a year ago. It is called, as a beautiful name, it's called "Using Differences in Abiotic Factors Between Seed Origin and Common Garden Sites to Predict Performance of Pacific Madrone." So I was wondering if you could give us a little breakdown about how you got wrapped up in madrone research and what you set out to study in these madrone common gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely got pulled in partly because I worked with Richard Snesko as in the same Dorina Genetic Resource Center outpost for the Forest Service. And Richard was kind enough to let me mess around with some data that he and a couple others were working with to keep myself fresh, learn a couple of new things. And a bunch of the other folks like Marianne and Gary out at Washington State University have been working for a very long time building these common garden sites, which, to be specific on what that means, is it's basically just, in this case, you're taking a bunch of seeds from all over the place, all over, at least within the range of Pacific Madrone, which goes pretty far down, up and down the west coast of at least the United States, going a little bit into kind of Mexico and up into Canada. And The thing that you're finding generally there is, so sorry, I'm going to check before I start talking smack because I feel like, yeah, no, real quick. I'm going to go say, I don't know that it actually goes far into Mexico. We'll say that it goes into
It
Canada at least.
I think we, live in this like nationalist bubble where, yeah, a lot of us don't go cross borders,
Right.
and particularly south into Mexico.
Right.
We have this iNaturalist project, and Marianne did make this pilgrimage down south into San Diego. And so we have this pinpointed, like this one tree, like deep into San Diego. I would say like very close to the border with what is now known as Mexico. But who knows if, in the recent past or even now, if we find arbutus into Mexico or where it overlaps, because our network, I would say, most definitely falls short of having colleagues, I guess, into Mexico. Who knows if there's maybe another arbutus too it overlaps with. So those are all questions. Those are all things I think about late at night.
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially thinking of research across borders. Like, how do we make sure that we're both like doing some of the transnational research as makes sense, but even recognizing that the ways that we collect data, the way we share data, all of that kind of stuff does definitely get more complicated. And so to go back to the common garden setup, what they have is at a couple different sites, mostly kind of in the more northern and towards the middle end of the range, so kind of around Northern California up into Washington state. They took seeds from all over the place, down from closer to kind of central California, all the way up north into that northern end of Washington, again, all kind of on the western coast. Took seeds from all over and planted them all in these spots. So if you go to one common garden site, it's one location, and you have all of these seeds from all over the place, all growing together. So the idea is you can see, okay, so we have the trees that are from California and the trees that are from Washington. Which ones are going to be growing better in Washington, let's say, or in this one part of Washington? And the thing that's really cool about that is it allows you theoretically to test for something called local adaptation, which y'all probably, a lot of folks are probably familiar with it, especially in the context of restoration. But the main idea here is that oftentimes when we're trying to choose seeds for restoration, you want to have seeds that are from nearby. We'll talk about local. And sometimes people will just talk about local species in general. So it's like you want a tree type or a bush type or a grass type that is found in your area. And a lot of times the idea is that those plants are adapted to local conditions, they can handle them better, and they also know how to interact with each other, or they've been doing it for a long time. And so, however they work together, whether things kind of help each other grow, don't help each other grow, at least we kind of vaguely know what those interactions are like. They're not necessarily new. So the same could be true even within a species, that trees that are used to kind of really hot and dry places will do better in the hot and dry places than, say, the trees even of the same species that are in a wet area, right? So if that's really true, then you end up with something called local adaptation. So even within a species, the seeds that are from an area nearby will handle those conditions better because they're used to them, because their grandparents, their great-grandparents were in that area and kind of had to survive those conditions. So that's kind of the basic idea, right, that what we're looking for with these common gardens. And so you have, and I should say the thing that's particularly unique about this is oftentimes you have like one common garden, right? So you take seeds from everywhere and you plant them in one place. And that's fine and dandy. But it's even better if you have multiple common gardens, right? And the reason that can often be better is what you can see is, let's take the most simple example. So we have location 1 and location 2, right? And we have seeds from locations 1 and 2 and common gardens in both of those places. So you take seeds from both location 1 and 2, plant them both in location 1, and you plant them both in location 2. So if we look at location 1, if you have local adaptation, what you should see is that the seeds from that area grow better than the seeds from location 2, right? In location 1. But what you should also see then in location 2 is the reverse, where the seeds from location 2 grow better than the seeds in location 1, right? So what you find there is kind of even more evidence for local adaptation, because if the seeds from location 1 grow better in both, that's not necessarily local adaptation. It just means that the seeds from location 1 are somehow doing better overall, right? You need to have that switch to actually seek a local adaptation. So that's what we were looking for in this data set, because it has multiple common garden sites. It's pretty unique, and to be able to check for that. What we actually found is a little bit funny in that we didn't see that switch where the local population was always doing better. They were often doing better, or at least better than average, which is good, right? That signs that there is probably some local adaptation. But then these seeds from the Willamette Valley, which for folks who don't know, are like kind of in this northern part of Oregon, a little bit kind of towards the middle, they did really well everywhere, and we're not sure why, to be honest. And I think it would be worth diving into a little bit more. What is it about those seed sources? Is it just that they can handle frost and heat? Like, what is it about those? But that was the one thing that was really surprising, is that rather than seeing just consistent patterns of local adaptation, we found those seeds in the Willamette Valley that did really well everywhere.
All right, so this is my reveal. These are the super trees from Central Oregon, right? And this is where I'm rolling with the information that's like of all the arbutus research that's out there. There's not a lot. Like we're just going with it, right? So, spitballing Marianne, she's like, well, why don't we just collect more seed from these places, right? So there's GPS coordinates associated with these mother trees, I guess, or these seed families, I guess you could call them. And it's like I should have memorized this, but it's like Wilsonville and like Xena or some other place. Yeah, Veneta. And so, yeah, and those seem to be the ones that, from my understanding, are growing most robustly, like putting on a lot of production and also showing less disease, right?
Yes, at
And
the
it's
very
sort of
least, they're
like
not dying as much,
not
which is
dying
big. Yeah.
slower.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and we've talked about the issues that this species is having, and and finding some resistant, I guess, genotypes is like the holy grail, right? And
Totally.
so, what we think about doing is, yeah, we've maybe pinpointed with some sort of accuracy, I think, is like finding like some high performing seeds or trees, propagating those seeds, and then bringing them up to Puget Sound to Seattle, and then planting them, and they were going to survive, and maybe someday like interchange DNA with some other local populations, and maybe, yeah, and they're gonna flourish.
I mean, that's the hope. And I think one of the things that you pointed to that's pretty key is that if you find something like the Willamette Valley trees seem to do better, like, sure, yeah, try spreading them out. As long as you also still have the local seed sources, you at least have some insulation. So if, like, there's something that we're not accounting for, let's say that the birds up in Puget Sound really like the seeds on, or the fruit on madrone that's from up north. If you have at least some of the local seeds still around, the birds aren't going to suddenly just like hate all madrone seeds. So you can do some of that mixing to make sure that you have a diversity, and that tends to be kind of the way to go in general. But the hope is, yeah, if there's some Willamette Valley trees that are really resistant to disease, great. That's like, we could use that, especially because, again, we're not transporting seeds super, super far. It's just like, how far north and south are we going?
Yeah. Yeah, and so for us, it seems to be the sweet spot, and that's the safest sort of climatic distance, I guess, everyone feels really comfortable with, like a couple of degrees of latitude, just reaching
Totally.
down into the ecoregion south of us. Similar elevation, similar, but just pre-adapted to maybe a little bit warmer conditions, but not super naive to like, other pathogens that they might encounter up here. There's a lot of similarities between the Puget Sound and the Willamette Valley. So this is the closest we get to like modeling appropriate seed transfer, I guess. So
Totally.
should anybody keep carrying this forward?
Totally. Oh, there's so much. For one, there's one site that we couldn't really look at because most of the trees just died. It was just a really rough site, but they replanted, and there's a lot of things that just down the road, if you can do some relatively simple corrections and or just use data from a little bit further down the road and compare that site to some of the others, and you're getting much further south and looking at some common garden site in California, which would be really cool to see just like what's going on in a much more arid climate. And are those Willamette Valley trees holding up there? Like, I guess we don't know. That'd be a good follow up. The other thing is like diving into why is the Willamette Valley doing so well? What is it about those trees? Like looking at the resistance, can we dive down and see if there's specific populations that are doing well, or is it something else? I think there's a lot of questions we can still ask there for sure. And the other thing is the climate is constantly changing, right? So what we've got now, I think, is a pretty solid starting place. And any follow up that you do down the road to see, okay, as you have more forest fires, as you've got like shifts in climate, either like flooding or drought and back and forth potentially between the two, do those trees still hold up? Because what we're seeing is that, especially for some of the ones that grow in dry sites, they might grow really, really, really slowly, right? Like really slowly, slower than everybody else, but they can handle a fire, or they can handle drought way better than the others. And that may not show up until you have a really big drought to help reveal those differences. So as you're watching these trees for longer, you can catch more of those kind of nuanced differences between populations, and we can have a much firmer and more confident view on which populations are handling what conditions better.
That's excellent. So, yeah, I'll put the link to the paper in the show notes. Everyone can read it for themselves.
Yeah.
And
And provide comments if you have any questions. Happy to email exchange with people.
So I feel like you moved off the West Coast. You're on the other end of the world. Does this have a big crosswalk to what you're doing now? Or are you doing things like totally different?
I think there's parts of almost like the ethos of it that I took more so than the specific science. Because right now I'm looking a lot less at population level data. So right now, maybe to give some general context, what I'm doing is looking at trees in cities. And specifically, can we see where trees are healthier and less healthy within cities? And a lot of what we'd expect is that maintenance has some kind of impact. But believe it or not, even though a lot of people know this, right? People have been maintaining trees for a long time. I mean, you were involved in some of this stuff in the city, right? Y'all know things. But the actual scientific literature, especially for mature trees, so big old trees, is actually not that robust. We don't have a lot of really good data on, okay, if I'm pruning a tree every 5 years, how much longer does it live? If I'm mulching a tree regularly, how much healthier does it look? If I'm watering a tree regularly, how much more shade does it provide? We actually don't have a lot of good numbers on that. And so the work I'm doing primarily with the Nature Conservancy is trying to focus on a lot of those questions, primarily in Chicago and in Durham. But some of the follow-ons and I think similarities with the madrone work are thinking critically about like, okay, what are differences across trees, the types of conditions they can handle, and potentially from a management perspective, what does it look like to make the science actually actionable? So wanting to make sure from a scientist perspective, again, hedging our bets, being like, okay, we need to be careful about, how strongly or firmly we recommend one thing or another when there's a lot of uncertainty. But at the same time, as a manager's perspective, you're like, okay, all of this scientific whatever is great, but like, can you tell me something? Like, what am I supposed to do? Or like, what is the things that you at least recommend? And so trying to do that careful kind of translation of here's the things we're pretty confident on, here's the things that we're really unsure about, but here's the suggestions based on your own knowledge and then what we built that we'd act on. So that's the piece that especially now I'm starting to dive into, and a lot of the things I learned from folks working on madrone have been really helpful in that part of the translation process.
Great. And from what I hear, but then too, some of the things you passed me, what I was reading was a lot of this, you're kind of doing community science as well, like you're involving people, at least in the data collection, if not the analysis. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. Especially, I would say most of the credit for that should definitely go to partners in
Okay.
Amani Village in Chicago. So, in
Yeah.
particular, there's this really cool program. They have a space called Amani Village that does a lot more than just kind of tree related work. They also partner with some folks looking at human health, and they have kind of healthcare focused staff and interns that they hire, but they also have a whole group of interns that focus on the tree work. And so they have some crossover, so they think about trees and human health together. But the folks who focus on trees, first, they go and try to look at a tree inventory. So Chicago does not have a complete tree inventory of the street trees. So they're going out and finding out which trees are where, which species, and how they're looking. And then they'll also work with private residents to do tree removals, potentially tree plantings if they have access to those. And sometimes I know trying to think about how we monitor long-term in Chicago trees through time so that we can see, okay, what maintenance treatments are actually helping? Are some species doing better than others over time? And can we get some real-time data to make these adjustments? And so I had the opportunity to work a little bit with them while I was there, whereas I separately was working kind of in a slightly different part of the city with a couple interns, and then in Durham also working with a couple interns and trying to kind of extend partnerships with a couple nonprofits that do a lot of tree planting and tree maintenance work in the city. Because in both places, there's kind of like the city itself does some amount of work on street trees, right? Especially the pruning and kind of the expensive big stuff. But then a lot of nonprofits will come in and do either like volunteer maintenance, volunteer plantings, and also support residents in doing their own care for the trees. So the thing that's particularly interesting about street trees is that you really can't study their health without taking into account communities and community members, because they're such an integral part of what keeps the trees either healthy or not. And oftentimes it's not that people don't care about trees or don't understand what trees are or something that means that there's tension. Instead, it's often that people really understand what trees do, and there's just not enough resources or support to deal with the more expensive or more intensive maintenance that's required for these trees, especially like pruning these big old trees. If you don't do that, the branches will fall on someone's house. And so getting to have conversations with people, see what they're noticing, see what problems are coming up has been really instructive, I think, in trying to analyze like what keeps these trees healthy, where are trees healthier than not, rather than me just saying, oh, it's areas that have less rooting space. Like, sure, that's part of it, certainly. But it's also you're seeing a pattern where the trees that tend to be less healthy are also the ones where there's a lot of turnover in housing. And what does that mean? Like, how do we dive a little bit into that housing policy and gentrification to think about how that shows up, not just for people's kind of lived experience, but also the lived experience of the trees?
Yeah, and in some of these neighborhoods, are you seeing like pretty low canopy cover overall in the urban area? I see you shaking your head. Like my city has 20% canopy cover, right? City of Tacoma. A lot of cities' ambitions, like 30% canopy cover, would be good to start to see a lot of those benefits from the textbook ecosystem services. I guess once you get that much decline in overall canopy cover, I feel like it's really hard to like climb our way back, especially when we talk about resilience to changing climate that's like happening now, like the responding to the changes we've already seen, if not further warming that we're going to get. So just warming
Absolutely.
is one thing, but it's one big stress. But obviously, you talked about some other stresses as well.
Absolutely. I mean, in Chicago has similar to what you were describing, often in the like 15 to 20% canopy cover, with some areas much lower and some areas a little bit higher. In Durham, it's actually much, much higher. It's as close as like 51% canopy cover overall. That is not super surprising, partly because this is a heavily forested region. We're in the Piedmont of North Carolina, which is certainly a big piece of it. The other thing is that makes it challenging, especially thinking of long-term canopy cover goals, is that in places like Durham, especially, most of the trees are on private property, which can be great insofar as there's a lot of private property that can be slightly bigger lots. You have kind of clumps of trees in a pseudo lump stand type of situation, which can often be better for the trees than being by themselves, though obviously it depends on the tree, and can give you a lot of ecosystem services that while individual trees near a street can do a lot, trees in a clump can do slightly different things. And it means that it's harder to protect, at least from a regulation level. So you have things like tree ordinances that mean that when people are building houses or doing construction or something, they have to protect certain numbers of trees on their property. But that is a hard thing to enforce, right? So if you're in trying to protect tree canopy cover in cities itself, like, yes, you have all these tree planting goals. We also have to think creatively of like, okay, how do we keep the trees we have healthy, like you're saying? And also, how do we think about engaging residents in making sure that the trees they have on their properties actually make sense? They're giving them kind of the ecosystem services that they need, but also they're kind of interacting with the trees in ways that keep the trees healthy long term. And that is no easy task. So there really isn't space for that many more trees unless you're going to start putting them on roofs or being super creative about that. And so we need to kind of expand how we think about green space in a lot of ways to get those services.
Yeah, I've been thinking about communities that I work with or in my community, just thinking about trees sometimes aren't always the answer. I don't know, like my neighbor, I love him, a couple doors down. He has this gigantic like western red cedar. He's like, I hate cedars. I hate them. It's like one of the two conifers on the block anyway. And so he's like, yeah, I just want to cut it down. I'm like, oh man. But the gateway isn't always to lead with trees, right? And just thinking about that tether with other necessities or desires that people have. 'Cause I'm the board member for this tree organization, right? We're like all about regreening and reversing this canopy decline. And I always think about like, we want to stay in our lane. We're very mission driven, but also we got to acknowledge and take the lead from communities, especially if we're reaching across town too, where we may not have like a real footprint or kind of membership there. Like we're offering support, but where are the real motivating factors coming from? And do I really even understand what people are going through?
Oh, totally. I come up a lot. The effort I said this myself, and then someone else said it much better than I did when I forget who it was. But the idea of like trees don't solve racism. Sometimes there's just this idea that trees are really going to come in here and solve all our problems, and that is just putting too much on trees. Especially if a lot of cities have these goals of creating kind of like healthy, thriving communities. So they'll want to plant trees to reduce heat island issues, for example, or you're planting trees to deal with stormwater. Stellar if that makes sense in your context. That does not often make sense in somewhere like the middle of the desert because trees don't do well in the middle of the desert. At least most of them don't. And so there's other ways you can create shade. There's other ways that you can deal with stormwater. Trees are a great option where they make sense, but they don't always make sense. And then on top of that, right, like residents have a lot of reasons for not wanting trees. And in Chicago, certainly, we talked to some people who loved it, were so excited across all kinds of like demographic and cultural groups. And there were also across all these demographic and social cultural groups, people who were like, absolutely not. I don't want this tree. I like when I grew up, a tree fell on my house and like kicked our family out. I don't want that. That's entirely reasonable. You don't want a tree falling on your house. And especially if you don't trust the local government or whoever's in charge of doing the pruning to actually take care of that tree, I would feel really hesitant in having a big tree in front of my house as well. And there's ways you can kind of build the trust and show people that there is the infrastructure in place to make sure that those trees are more of a a boon than they are a potential burden. But even then, you're still cleaning up the leaves, you're still dealing with seeds, there's still like accessibility issues in terms of the size of the sidewalk. And so thinking of them as like one part of a toolbox, I think is super important. And like you said, leading kind of with what communities are telling you. And in particular, like talking to nonprofits with that mission creep issue where you're like, we're an org who's really good at planting trees, but we also think like environmental justice is important. So we don't want to force everybody to have trees when what we really want is environmental justice. I think the big piece there is hopefully you're not the only organization thinking about environmental justice. I like if that's the case, we're in some trouble, right? And what I think is super important is being part of what we call kind of like a movement ecology. So you're with other nonprofits, other community organizations, other activist groups, and hopefully across the whole group of people, there's people who have the expertise and knowledge to bring kind of the range of services and needs that a community has. If you have 5 tree groups and no one who can do anything about housing, that's a good reason to ask, like, do we really need another tree group? And like, it doesn't make more sense for us to, in fact, like be a housing group or like move in that direction. And I think it's good to ask yourselves those questions. But it's not necessarily bad to be someone who's really good at planting trees, because there are communities who need trees. It's just a matter that kind of make sure that you're connected to the other groups that can build kind of holistically together towards the future we want to build, and not go at it as though the tool you have is always the thing that is necessary in a situation.
Exactly. The trees versus housing sometimes boils over, at least in my community. If not, I'm sure it happens in other ones. Yeah, supporting unhoused folks is another one, I think, that's like very political right now. The other one is just like, yeah, police brutality. So, yeah, just like aligning or building like a broader kind of mutual aid, I think, is maybe the answer, perhaps.
Totally. It is hard though. And one thing I will say, at least, especially with the housing trees tension in places like Durham, there's sometimes this narrative that if you build green spaces, you're taking away affordable housing. You can paint the narrative that there's a limited space. We need to either pick a park or affordable housing. But the reality of it is, it's not how the world works, right? There is limited space, yes, but we're already choosing to build fancy housing developments. That's like treated as a given. And I think the question is why? Like, why are we treating that as the thing that's constant and we're only negotiating affordable housing and parks? And also, why is there this assumption that people in affordable housing don't deserve to have parks? Because there's sometimes this idea that, like, yeah, we're going to build affordable housing, put as many houses as possible right in this area so it's cheap, and they don't get any trees because that takes up space. And you're like, heaven forbid, maybe people who are in affordable housing also deserve to be near green spaces and near parks, and we should instead be challenging some of the other land uses we have and the zoning practices we have that mean that this is the fight that we're having, instead of thinking more holistically about the kind of like trade-offs and conversations we need to have. And sometimes that can mean that you instead kind of, when you think of it in a slightly different angle, can have the tree groups and the affordable housing groups really on the same page advocating for like decent zoning policies that make sure that you prioritize both of those needs if that's something the community is asking for. But sometimes there are very limited budgets, and you just need to recognize that if the community is asking for more housing and fewer parks, that's something that you need to negotiate with community, rather than necessarily saying, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Which is sometimes what ends up happening.
That's true. Just thinking about some of your activism, and you mentioned this at the beginning of the conversation, just kind of about some of the systems change. I was very taken with the list of books that you presented that I think inspired you. I've never read all of them, but there were some great ones. I just want to mention them. I don't know if you want to talk about this. Audre Lorde is on there. My sweetie pie, Adrienne Maree Brown, who I adore. Is there any inspiration or anything you've read recently that sort of has been inspiring for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I've taken, especially like Audre Lorde, is thinking about what our own experiences and position in relationship to the dominant way things function helps us see. So what I mean by that is, within science, a lot of times, classically, you're trained to like do things a certain way from this established format that showed up hundreds of years, well, however many years ago, depending on who you ask, and you're going to do it this way because this is the right way. And what people, especially people like Audre Lorde, have been agitating is like, when you recognize the voices of people who have been outside that dominant framework, whose knowledge has not been considered to be up to par, or who have been excluded from those spaces wherein that kind of traditional framework has been created, a lot of times you really expand the possibilities for the futures you can create. And in particular, like what she's talking about is really Black women and how they're often were marginalized from both kind of women's rights movements and the civil rights movement from being slightly outside both of those camps because they were not white women, but they were also not Black men. And so there was kind of this intersectionality that made them see things slightly differently and push for kind of intersectional movement that was really, really powerful. And certainly Black women are not the only people in that position, but it's a good example of that sort of push and drive that pushes us in a different way. And I think emergent strategy, a lot of Adrienne Marie Brown, is partly thinking of how small things together can lead to big change and not necessarily ignoring the little things, which I think is important to not only hold on to the little things. Sometimes it's like, if all you do is like plant a garden, I understand some people are like, I am creating the revolution. I'm like, yes, and also we should engage in larger political systems. I'm going to argue, but little things like planting trees, building community, talking to people, I do think make some kind of difference. If for nothing else, then it like shows people how they can exist in community and be together. And if we're doing that with people who are outside of those voices of who is traditionally prioritized, who fits into the dominant narrative, who is considered scientists, then again, kind of the combination of those two things really opens up the possibilities that are in front of us. And I think is what we need to be able to think creatively about resilient cities and resilient futures. Because the options ahead of us right now, they're certainly better than what we are doing in terms of like dealing with climate change. We've got options on the table that could make things better already, let me tell you. But a lot of them still aren't where we want to go, right? Like they still don't create perfect justice. They still don't create perfect health in the futures we want to see. And so interacting with a wider range of people, thinking critically about whose knowledge is valued, I think is super key. The other thing I'll throw in there as a last plug of recent reading I've had is Angela Davis. I reread Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And the thing that I really appreciated from Angela Davis's work, beyond thinking more about why we consider punishment and specifically like jails and prisons to be necessary, is again like that pushing of our imagination to rethink what is possible, which again feels really key in a moment when the climate crisis feels so impending and so dire, and all the things we have available to us feel so small in comparison to that. I think holding that hope of like reimagining is a really big piece of that, but also that international solidarity piece, which I know we touched on a little bit at the beginning, but it's just like being aware of what happens in the United States is influenced and influences things that happen in other countries and how we can learn from and grow with one another. And in particular, in my work, trying to think about people in Latin America, especially who draw from like Buen Vivir and some of the principles that give more rights and consideration to non-human beings, and thinking of them as kind of like people who exist with us rather than just things we exploit, and what that means for how we exist with and amongst each other. And there's, Swaraj and various other things that exist more in kind of the context of India that are also, I think, challenging the ways that we exist both with each other and with other living beings, and push for kind of different ideas of democracy. And a lot of this, frankly, is what gives me hope, but also pushes me to be a little bit more maybe broad thinking in my work. Because as a scientist, it's very easy to get just stuck in what's in front of you and the methods you have and the tools you've got. And you're getting, again, your like jackhammer and your hammer, and you're just going at that screw, as I mentioned at the original problem. But if you kind of expand well beyond, then maybe we can think critically about how we actually tackle climate change and think about racial justice more expansively than just planting trees, because that's the tool we have in front of us.
Yeah, that stuff's so good. We could just have a book club chat. I'm like, oh, I wish I'd wrote that. Yeah, some of those threads work themselves into the podcast, I hope. Every once in a
That's
while.
awesome.
Even a presentation I gave like last week, talking about emergence, like just thinking about networking underground, like mimicking nature. It's not always visible. It's small. It's not always visible. Like we interact with trees like above ground, but just building our social network underground is very important. Yeah, so in my own efforts, maybe in your own too, like with Arbutus menziesii, with madrone, I don't know, sometimes it seems so personal, like who else cares? Is there any crosswalk to like justice at all? And I think some of it is like reaching out and learning more about the cultural values and how it was used and still is used by indigenous folks. I think it's something like I just haven't made that connection yet. There's maybe something happening, but then thinking about that transnational approach, I would love to like organize with other Arbutus fans out there, because there's this old world connection we have to like Arbutus Unido. Who knows, like if there's some group organizing around like Arbutus arizonica in the Sky Islands of Arizona. And that's the cool thing, I think, like by podcasting during the pandemic, being able to connect with guests virtually, we're able to network like we haven't before. We're very much comfortable, I think, maybe more with technology. not that Zoom is going to change the world, but like we're going to able to like talk across borders and be able to converse with people in like the UK, Hawaii, South America or whatnot. I don't take it for granted. I'm very grateful for it in some
Totally.
ways.
It makes a lot of things more accessible for a broader range of people, both
Mhm.
who, like, especially a lot of the conferences are centered in either Western Europe or the United States and are not always easy to get to. And making it both more accessible in terms of, like, for folks who are disabled, for our colleagues who do not have, hundreds of dollars to be dropping on flights all over the place. It means that you can just connect with a lot more people. I also recognize there is a value to kind of getting to know place and seeing things and getting to talk to people in that way. And so it's getting to hold both. But I think I hope we continue to hold the power and connectivity that comes from some of these technologies as something that we continue to have with us alongside some of the in-person things that we can do.
I struggle sometimes. I think with podcasts is like it's accessible, but is it for
Totally, it's to
everybody?
whom.
Yeah.
It's to whom. And that's why I think both are critical, is that there's a whole group of people who don't have broadband internet access or aren't auditory processors or maybe deaf, and or the accessibility needs that exist in the podcast might be limited, what have you. And so there's a lot of reasons that there are a benefit to either in person or kind of other forms of communication. The hope is that we hold them all kind of continuing together. Because it's also, at least in my work, I will say, and this is a split in the scientific community, I will admit, I find that I got an immense amount of value from being in the places I was studying and getting to talk to people who live there and see it myself in that. And it changed the way I'm analyzing the data and going and thinking about the outcomes, because I learned so much more than I think I personally could have from just reading it from someone else's accounts. I'm not sure how to replace that in some instances where, like, I don't know that I would have learned quite as much about people's experiences dealing with this and what their expectations were for pruning and how much that varied dramatically across neighborhoods that were right next to each other if I hadn't been there. Even if I read it, I don't know that it would internalize quite the same way. And so, yeah, how do you keep that and some of the value of learning and growing and being in community with people in that way while also recognizing the power of some of these other methods?
Exactly. That's true. Do I still have you for a little bit longer? Seems like it's getting dark. But I also have another question. It's a staple tree hugger question about what your favorite tree is.
Oh, great question.
And I will give you some grace if it's not madrone.
I will say madrone is definitely my top 3. It's in my top three.
Great.
Partly because it's a beautiful tree. Hopefully people listening to this podcast have seen a madrone, but if you haven't and you have access to Google, strongly recommend looking it up. Absolutely stunning tree. Beautiful bark. There's 2 that I have, and one is just from being a kid. I really like a weeping willow, Salix babylonica. Beautiful canopy. It's really just that it's oftentimes by water and you see it and it's kind of like leaning over, looking like kind of having that weeping style leaves. And I was taken with it from very, very young and I thought it was beautiful. The other one, which I know I'm cheating because I'm giving you far too many trees, for which I apologize, is one that I learned about recently, actually, when I was in the Morton Arboretum, because a paperbark maple is one of the common names for it. I believe native to parts of China, if I remember correctly, but y'all would highly recommend looking up this one too for the bark. I will admit that my favorite trees do vacillate, but this one I'm taken with at the moment.
Those are good ones. I think I've seen this, the peely bark on the maple around the neighborhood. Yeah, definitely did a few jogs down this one street over here that I'm pointing to that no one can see. I did like a little double take because peely bark is like one of my superpowers in scene. Another question I often ask is like, do you have any advice for people that might be considering or maybe kind of on a similar track to yours? Even think about academia. Is it something you would encourage others to do?
Ooh.
Is there some pitfalls people should look out for if they're imagining that in their future?
Oh, absolutely. I would say with pretty much any career path, speaking specifically about research, there is mess and bureaucratic nightmares and frustrations to deal with everywhere. It's just which brand and what degree. So for me, I spent time looking at, again, kind of like working pseudo with the federal government, at least in this kind of odd outpost to the Forest Service, trying to see what are the things that being in that kind of position really facilitates and makes easier, and what are the things that become a headache that come with that, especially kind of the bureaucratic mess of working for the federal government. Nonprofits, similarly, the grant cycles and the constant fundraising and kind of the ethical dilemmas that come with some of that work and who your partners can be keep coming up in that sort of space. And in academia, there's its own brand of kind of publish or perish, is the idea that you have to put out these papers or a certain number of papers. Otherwise, you're not considered productive enough, and you are no longer able to keep your job or certainly be able to get tenure. And there's a lot of pressure to kind of produce often what is high quality in a scientific perspective work, but may not be high quality in like community impact and community relationships. And so kind of the incentives in academia do not always align with what justice demands, I would say, is just the truth of it. Depending on where you work, sometimes you have more flexibility to be creative about that and to push for the time you need to build relationships with community or to do the work that is less glamorous that is necessary because that's what the community is asking for. But that is something that is not incentivized oftentimes in most academic settings, I'll say. And it's also just challenging from a boundary perspective. There are some jobs that you get to just end. Like you have set hours, you work them, and then you're done. And not saying those hours are easy. Often those hours are very hard, but they're set. In academia, there are no hours in that way. You can set them, and some people do, and that's fantastic, but it really can take whatever hours you give it. And that in some ways reminds me of some of what happens with community organizing, is there's always more important things that need to be done. There's always the next thing that's coming up that has a strong deadline, and it can take as much time as you're willing to give it. So another thing is really figuring out for yourself what are those boundaries and being clear about that. And so people, I think, as you're trying to figure out where you want to work, especially if you're interested like me in research, I would strongly recommend giving yourself a chance to be exposed to a lot of it and being honest with yourself about what frustrations you're willing to handle and which ones you're just really struggle with. And also just recognize that it's unlikely there will be none. I think you will have frustrations and things that annoy you and things that are inefficient and frustrating. But hopefully you find the ones that you can handle rather than the ones that make you slowly lose your mind.
That's good advice. I do. And I totally have gone over time, and I want to respect your time. I want to give you a chance to rest because I feel like you talked about the grind of the PhD, and I feel like you're working hard, getting after it. You're one of the madrone heroes in my life, and yeah, you deserve all the rest that you want.
So do you. I was going to say, I love that you're out here and doing a lot of work for Madrone and talking to other people with Madrone, keeping that network connected, which is exciting.
Oh, you cannot believe we're going to have such a great annual meeting. We call it
so
annual
excited.
Meeting. We'll send you the invitation. Probably in late winter, there's some good research out there and the projects I think we're going to elevate. Good stuff. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to get to chat with you a little bit.
All right, see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Please check the show description for more information about Renata Kamakura, or you can find more at their website linked in the show notes. So I dearly appreciate that conversation with Renata, and I'm grateful to all my guests from 2022. I want to give them all a shout out. Climate psychologist Leslie Davenport, naturopathic doctor Janine Krause, UK geographer Laura Smith, English professor and poet Jenny Liu, Doctora Nature Jessica Hernandez, Deliberate Cold Exposure Guide Renata Rain, Restoration Historian Laura J. Martin, and lastly, author and restoration extensionist Elise Gornish. We made some memories, and it takes a community to keep the podcast going. I want to remind you about the Reimagine Restoration store that is now up. Follow the link in the show note. Enter the code REIMAGINE for 10% off all the merchandise that's there until the end of January 2023. Additionally, you can find me on PayPal and Venmo and Cash App. Those links are in the show notes as well. The archive of this episode lives online at treehuggerpod.com. Tree Hugger Podcast is on social media at treehuggerpod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review this show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show, or tell your friends and family about the show. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the urban woods.